Chapter 1. Dawn over the canals. The first light of dawn crept quietly over Venice, casting a pale gold shimmer across its endless web of canals. In the 1500s, the city did not wake with sudden noise or chaos. Instead, Venice stirred slowly, almost gently, as if rising from a long, uneasy sleep. The water reflected the soft colors of the sky, muted pinks, faded oranges, and silvery blues, while the stone buildings stood tall and silent, their facades worn smooth by centuries of salt air and passing tides. Before most citizens opened their shutters, the canals were already alive. Gondoliers were among the earliest to rise. Wrapped in heavy cloaks against the morning chill, they guided their narrow boats through the still water with practiced ease. The rhythmic dip of the oar was one of the first sounds of the day, echoing softly between narrow alleys and bridges. For these men, the canals were not romantic pathways. They were roads, lifelines, and places of hard labor. Each stroke meant another chance to earn a living in a city where water ruled everything. As the sky brightened, fishermen returned from the lagoon. Their small boats carried baskets filled with fish caught before sunrise, eels, mullet, and sea bass, still glistening with seawater. They moved quickly, knowing that freshness meant profit. At the markets, merchants and cooks would soon argue over prices, but for now, the fishermen enjoyed a few quiet moments as Venice continued to awaken. Church bells marked the passage of time, their deep tones rolling across the city like invisible waves. These bells were more than calls to prayer. They were Venice's clock. In an age before personal timepieces were common, the sound of bells told people when to rise, when to work, and when to worship. The faithful paused in their routines, crossing themselves as the echoes faded into the morning air. Windows began to open above the canals. Women leaned out to shake rugs and cloths, sending dust drifting down toward the water below. The smell of fresh bread soon followed, carried from bakeries tucked into tight corners of the city. Bakers worked through the night so that loaves would be ready at dawn, feeding a population that depended on routine and rhythm. Bread, simple and essential, was the foundation of daily life, especially for the poor. Children were among the last to emerge. Rubbing sleep from their eyes, they followed their parents through narrow streets and across arched bridges. Some were sent on errands, to fetch water, deliver messages, or help in family shops. Others prepared for lessons, though education was a privilege not shared equally. For many children, the canals themselves became classrooms, teaching balance, caution, and survival in a city where falling into the water was a constant risk. Above all of this loomed the grandeur of Venice's architecture. Palaces rose directly from the canals, their reflections trembling in the water below. These buildings were symbols of power and wealth, reminders that Venice was not just a city, but a republic built on trade, ambition, and control of the seas. Yet even these mighty structures were vulnerable, slowly sinking, slowly eroding, just like the empire they represented. As the sun climbed higher, the quiet calm of dawn gave way to movement and noise. Merchants prepared their stalls, boat traffic increased, and voices filled the air in a dozen accents from across Europe and beyond. Dawn was over. Venice was fully awake. But those early hours mattered. They revealed the true soul of the city, not the masks, the festivals, or the splendor, but the ordinary rhythm of survival. In the soft light over the canals, Venice showed itself as a living, breathing place, balanced between water and stone, beauty and hardship, hope and uncertainty. Chapter 2. The Lives of Ordinary Venetians. As the sun climbed above the rooftops, Venice in the 1500s shifted fully into motion. For ordinary Venetians, daily life was shaped by routine, responsibility, and the constant presence of water. This was not a city of leisure for most people. It was a place where survival depended on hard work, social order, and knowing one's role in a tightly structured society. The majority of Venetians belonged to the working class. Boatmen, porters, craftsmen, sailors, and shopkeepers formed the backbone of the city. Gondoliers spent long hours navigating canals, transporting goods and people from one district to another. Their work demanded strength, balance, and deep knowledge of the waterways. A single mistake, misjudging a tide or colliding with another boat, could mean injury, loss of income, or worse. Shopkeepers opened their wooden shutters early in the day. Small stores lined the narrow streets, selling candles, cloth, tools, and everyday household items. Competition was fierce, and reputation mattered. A dishonest merchant could quickly lose customers in a city where news traveled fast. Bargaining was part of daily life, and markets buzzed with voices arguing over prices, quality, and weight. Women's lives were centered largely around the home, but their role was no less demanding. They managed households, prepared food, raised children, and often contributed economically by sewing, laundering, or assisting in family businesses. Water had to be carried, meals cooked over open flames, and clothing repaired constantly. Wealthier women lived more sheltered lives, but for poorer families, every pair of hands was essential. Food was simple and repetitive for most Venetians. Bread, beans, vegetables, and fish formed the core of daily meals. Meat was a luxury, rarely eaten by the poor. Fish, however, was abundant due to Venice's connection to the sea. Meals were practical rather than indulgent, designed to sustain long working days rather than provide pleasure. Hunger was a constant fear, especially during times of disease or trade disruption. Children grew up quickly in Venice. From a young age, they were expected to help their families. Boys often learned their father's trade, becoming apprentices in workshops or assisting on boats. Girls were taught domestic skills early, preparing them for marriage or service in another household. Play existed, but it was woven into work. Games near the canals, races across bridges, laughter echoing briefly before responsibilities called them back. Housing reflected social class clearly. Poor families lived in cramped apartments with little light or ventilation. Several generations often shared a single space. Wealthier citizens occupied larger homes, sometimes with views of the canals, though even these residences were damp and vulnerable to flooding. Privacy was rare. Life was lived openly, with sounds, smells, and voices constantly passing through thin walls and open windows. Social order governed everything. Venice was proud of its stability, and citizens were expected to follow strict laws. Curfews, clothing regulations, and trade rules shaped behavior. Breaking these laws could result in fines, public shame, or imprisonment. Yet, despite the rigid system, people found ways to enjoy small freedoms: conversation, music, shared meals, and moments of rest along the water's edge. Ordinary Venetians were deeply connected to their city. They understood its dangers, its beauty, and its demands. Floods, disease, and economic uncertainty were always present, but so was resilience. Day after day they woke, worked, and endured, keeping Venice alive not through power or wealth, but through persistence. This was the true heart of Venice in the 1500s. Not the palaces or ceremonies, but the people who carried water, rowed boats, baked bread, and raised children in a city floating between survival and splendor. Chapter 3. Trade, Wealth, and Power. By the 1500s, Venice had become one of the most powerful trading cities in Europe, and its wealth shaped every corner of daily life. The city's position at the crossroads of East and West turned it into a vast marketplace where goods, ideas, and ambitions flowed as freely as the water through its canals. Trade was not just an occupation in Venice, it was the foundation of its identity. From early morning, merchant ships arrived from distant ports, unloading cargo that filled the air with unfamiliar scents and colors. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were among the most valuable goods, prized not only for flavor, but for their rarity. Silk, fine wool, glass, and precious metals passed through Venetian hands before being sold across Europe. Each shipment represented months of travel and enormous risk, but also the promise of great profit. At the center of this commercial world stood the merchants. Successful traders lived lives of comfort unknown to ordinary workers. Their homes were decorated with imported fabrics, polished furniture, and artwork that displayed both wealth and taste. They dressed in fine clothing and moved confidently through markets and council halls, aware that money granted influence in Venice. Yet wealth also came with responsibility. The city expected its richest citizens to support public projects, fund defenses, and contribute to the Republic's stability. The markets of Venice were vibrant and chaotic. Traders shouted prices, buyers inspected goods, and deals were sealed with handshakes and quick calculations. Currency exchanged hands constantly, and ledgers recorded every transaction with careful precision. Trust was essential. A single broken agreement could damage a merchant's reputation beyond repair. In a city built on commerce, honor was as valuable as gold. Venice's power extended beyond its markets. The city controlled key trade routes across the Mediterranean, using its navy to protect shipping lanes and enforce its interests. Armed galleys escorted merchant vessels, deterring pirates and rival powers. The sea was both Venice's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, demanding constant investment in ships, sailors, and weapons. The gap between rich and poor was impossible to ignore. While merchants enjoyed luxury, laborers carried heavy loads, worked long hours, and earned modest wages. Dock workers unloaded ships under harsh conditions, exposed to injury and disease. Sailors risked their lives on long voyages, often returning home to little recognition. Yet many accepted this inequality as the natural order of life in Venice, believing that the city's prosperity benefited everyone in some way. Political power in Venice was closely tied to wealth. The Republic was governed by an elite class that claimed to protect stability above all else. Elections were controlled, offices were limited, and political influence rarely reached beyond established families. This system prevented chaos, but it also ensured that power remained concentrated. Ordinary citizens had little voice, even though their labor sustained the city. Despite its riches, Venice lived with constant anxiety. Trade depended on peace, and war could disrupt supply lines overnight. New trade routes threatened Venice's dominance, and rivals watched closely for signs of weakness. Behind the glitter of wealth lay fear. Fear of decline, fear of losing control, fear that the golden age might not last. Trade brought Venice glory, but it also revealed the fragile balance holding the city together. Wealth created beauty, power, and influence, yet it rested on endless effort and uncertainty. In the 1500s, Venice stood at its peak, rich, proud, and commanding, but the currents beneath the surface were already shifting. Chapter 4. Religion, Fear, and Disease. In 16th century Venice, religion was not separate from daily life. It was woven into every action, every decision, and every fear. The city's beauty and wealth could not protect it from the deep anxieties that shaped the minds of its people. Beneath the grandeur of churches and the confidence of trade lay a constant awareness of mortality. In Venice, life and death existed side by side, and faith was the bridge between them. Church bells rang throughout the day, calling citizens to prayer, marking holy hours, and reminding everyone of divine authority. Nearly every neighborhood had its own church, and attendance was expected. Religion offered comfort, order, and explanation in a world that often felt unpredictable. People believed that prosperity was a blessing from God and that suffering was a punishment or a test. This belief became especially powerful during times of disease. Plague outbreaks had scarred Venice for generations, and even in the 1500s, the memory of mass death remained fresh. The arrival of illness brought immediate fear. People watched for signs: fever, swelling, weakness, and whispered prayers at the first cough. When disease spread, entire households could be lost within days. Venice responded to disease with both faith and innovation. The city was one of the first in Europe to establish quarantine systems. Ships arriving from infected ports were isolated, and the sick were sent to special islands outside the city. Yet for ordinary people, these measures brought little comfort. Being taken away often meant never returning. Families were separated, homes were sealed, and fear filled the streets. Religious processions became common during outbreaks. Citizens walked through the city carrying candles, relics, and statues of saints, begging for protection. Many believed the plague was a result of sin, and public repentance became a form of defense. Fasting, confession, and prayer increased as people searched for meaning in suffering they could not control. Superstition flourished alongside faith. Amulets were worn, strange remedies were trusted, and rumors spread faster than disease itself. Some blamed foreigners, others blamed the poor, and some believed the stars had turned against them. Knowledge was limited, and fear filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Death was a visible part of daily life. Funerals passed through narrow streets regularly, and the sound of mourning became familiar. Graves filled quickly, and bodies were often buried without ceremony during severe outbreaks. Children grew up understanding that life was fragile, and survival felt uncertain even in times of peace. Yet religion also brought strength. Churches offered refuge, not only spiritual, but social. People gathered, shared grief, and supported one another. Art and architecture reflected this devotion. Paintings of suffering saints, solemn altars, and grand cathedrals designed to inspire awe and humility. Faith gave Venetians a sense of purpose, even when faced with unimaginable loss. In Venice, religion, fear, and disease were inseparable forces. They shaped behavior, beliefs, and community bonds. While trade and wealth defined the city's power, it was faith that helped its people endure. In the shadow of illness and death, Venetians clung to belief, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it offered meaning in a world where certainty was rare. Chapter 5. Nights of music, masks, and secrets. When the sun disappeared behind the rooftops of Venice, the city transformed. In the 1500s, night did not bring silence, it brought freedom. As darkness settled over the canals, lamps flickered to life, their reflections trembling on the water. The narrow streets filled with shadows, and Venice revealed a different face, one hidden from daylight and rules. Music drifted through the air. From taverns and private homes came the sound of lutes, viols, and soft singing. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and easing the weight of long working days. Taverns were gathering places for sailors, craftsmen, and travelers from distant lands. Stories were exchanged, some true, many exaggerated, about storms at sea, lost fortunes, and secret dealings. These nights were an escape, a brief moment when hardship could be forgotten. Masks played a powerful role in Venetian nightlife, though often associated with festivals. Masks were worn regularly, allowing people to move anonymously through the city. A mask erased social boundaries. A merchant could speak freely with a laborer, a noble could wander unnoticed, and forbidden meetings could take place without consequence. Anonymity was both thrilling and dangerous, encouraging desire, deception, and intrigue. Romance flourished in the shadows. Lovers met on quiet bridges or in gondolas gliding silently through dark canals. Words were whispered, promises made and risks taken. Venice was a city where secrecy was easy and temptation was everywhere. Relationships crossed class lines, and passion often ignored social rules that governed daylight hours. But night also belonged to crime. Thieves used darkness and masks to their advantage, slipping through alleys and boarding unattended boats. Smuggling thrived, especially of untaxed goods such as wine and spices. Gambling houses operated discreetly, drawing people eager to risk what little they had for the promise of sudden wealth. Authorities attempted to control these activities, but Venice's maze-like streets made enforcement difficult. Despite the dangers, nightlife was essential to Venice's culture. Festivals filled the city with color and energy, bringing together citizens from all walks of life. Music, laughter, and celebration reminded people that life was more than labor and survival. These moments of joy strengthened social bonds and gave meaning to the hardships of daily existence. Yet beneath the pleasure lay constant tension. Secrets were currency, and trust was fragile. A careless word or wrong encounter could ruin reputations or attract unwanted attention. Venice thrived on appearances, and night allowed those appearances to be tested, bent or broken. By dawn, the city would return to order. Masks were removed, taverns closed, and silence reclaimed the canals. But the memories of the night lingered, of music, laughter, danger, and desire. In the 1500s, Venetian nights were not merely entertainment. They were an essential part of life, revealing the city's hidden soul and the human need for escape in a world ruled by structure and expectation. Chapter 6. A city balanced between glory and decline. In the 1500s, Venice stood at a moment of quiet tension. To the outside world, it still appeared powerful, wealthy, and untouchable, a city rising from the sea, crowned with marble and gold. But beneath the surface, Venetians sensed that their world was changing. Daily life continued as it always had, yet the certainty of eternal dominance was beginning to fade. Trade, once the unquestioned source of Venice's strength, faced new challenges. Emerging trade routes bypassed the Mediterranean, drawing wealth toward other parts of Europe. Ships still arrived in Venetian ports, markets still bustled, but whispers of competition grew louder. Merchants who once felt invincible now calculated risks more carefully, aware that fortune could shift with the tides. Politically, Venice remained stable, and this stability was its greatest pride. While other European cities faced rebellions and chaos, Venice preserved order through strict governance. Laws were enforced, traditions protected, and change introduced slowly, if at all. This cautious approach maintained peace, but it also limited adaptation. Innovation was often viewed with suspicion, and clinging to tradition became both a strength and a weakness. For ordinary Venetians, life went on. Gondoliers still rode, bakers still worked through the night, and families gathered for simple meals. Most people were not concerned with global trade or political strategy. Their focus remained survival, feeding children, avoiding disease, and finding moments of joy amid routine. Yet even they noticed subtle shifts, fewer opportunities, tighter wages, and growing uncertainty about the future. The city itself reflected this balance between glory and decay. Magnificent buildings stood proudly along the canals, but time and water slowly eroded their foundations. Flooding was frequent, maintenance constant, and the cost of preservation immense. Venice was beautiful, but fragile, a reminder that even the grandest achievements require endless effort to endure. Despite these challenges, pride remained strong. Venetians believed deeply in their republic and their identity as citizens of a unique city. They had conquered the sea, built wealth from trade, and maintained independence through discipline and unity. This shared identity created resilience, allowing Venice to face uncertainty without panic. As the century progressed, it became clear that Venice was no longer rising, it was holding on. Yet this moment was not defined by collapse, but by endurance. The city continued to function, adapt slowly, and preserve its way of life against growing pressures. Glory and decline coexisted, shaping a society that valued stability over expansion. In the end, Venice in the 1500s was a city suspended between past triumphs and an uncertain future. Its people lived ordinary lives within extraordinary surroundings, unaware of how history would judge their era. What remains today is not just the memory of power, but the story of human persistence, of a city that refused to disappear even as the world around it changed. If you enjoyed this journey through daily life in Venice during the 1500s, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which European city you want to explore next in history.